Good afternoon. How is everyone? Go straight to the comments. You know how we do with the Race Bridge conversations. If you're here, go straight to the comments. Let us know what you're looking forward to from today's conversation. Excited to engage with all of you. My name is Corey Jo Biddle, and I'm the Executive Director of Fuel Milwaukee, and welcome to today's Race Bridge conversation. Today is all about human connections and the power of interracial friendships to create a race bridge, so to speak, in the quest for equity and inclusion. This conversation is now one of over 30 discussions that Fuel has hosted under the Race Bridge brand, which started over a year ago. This program would not have been possible without your enthusiastic support and participation. So thanks to all the Fuelers and Milwaukeeans who are tuning in and participating and making these discussions a place for connection and healing. Another special thank you goes out to our Race Bridge presenting sponsor, the Luter Financial Group of Northwestern Mutual. The Luter Group is the lead sponsor for our spring and summer series of monthly discussions. We are so excited to have the Luter Group participating, and the fact that they really found value in what we were doing and wanted to be a part of it. If you are in career transition, or if you know folks that are looking to start careers or change careers and have any interest in the finance world, check out the Luter Financial Group. We also would like to thank our media sponsor, 88.9 Radio Milwaukee. Through music and stories created for a culturally open-minded community, 88.9 Radio Milwaukee is a catalyst for creating a better, more inclusive and engaged Milwaukee. And as I always say, they're easily one of the most listenable stations in Milwaukee. We actually have a screenshot there of their website. There's more than music. They tell stories about Milwaukee and everything that makes our community a distinct place. So check them out. Thanks again to our media sponsor. Okay, now on to today's conversation. For this one, we will start by looking inward. That means looking at our own social circle or our own circles of influence. Question for you, and maybe you can go to the chat. We'll do an informal poll in the chat. How many of your close friends or people in your network are a different race from you? If you're like most Americans, your answer will be not many. The Public Religion Research Institute conducted a study about race and friendship, and here's what they found. 75% of white Americans report that the network of people with whom they discuss important matters is entirely white with no minority presence. So this composition of core relationships discuss important matters that we're trying to get to the crux of like how we relate to each other. So this slide is all about close friends, people that are like in our core network, work pretty close to us, good friends, family members, true circle of influence folks. Now for Black Americans, 65% of them reported having a core social network that was composed entirely of people who are also Black, and 40% of Hispanic Americans reported that their social networks included only people who are also identifying as Hispanic. So it's a lot of homogeny across the board. Okay, so imagine now we're talking. This is a little bit looser than the core network. We're saying friends in the loose way that you would say friends on like, oh, this is my Facebook friend. So not quite that loose, but these are people that you would know, people you associate with, people who you might be able to call or email, and in a friendly, cordial sort of manner. So this is what we mean on this slide. So imagine that each of these people on the slide. So we have the average white American. Imagine they have 100 friends. The average Black American, imagine they have 100 friends. In your own life, if you had 100 friends and you invited them all to a party, this is who would be at the party. So for the white Americans, would be 91 folks who are also white. There would be one Black friend, one Latino, one Asian, one mixed race person, and 4 people who would be of other or unknown race. For Black folks, it would be 83 Black people, 8 white friends, 2 Latino friends, 0 Asian friends, 3 mixed race friends, and about 5 people who are of other or unknown race. Isn't that interesting? Think about what your party of 100 people would look like in your life. It might be totally different than this, or it might be the same. So let's look inward. I find this really interesting. I think you all do too. Dominique Samari also thought this is really interesting. So she conducted this experiment that was at the time called the Belonging Project, which was a multi-month experience where people were paired together with someone of a different race and encouraged to have some very strategic conversations with one another. Today, we have Dominique and some of the participants of the Belonging Project, which is now called KIN. So I'm glad to have with us today the founder of this project and partner at P3 Development Group, Dominique Samari. Hey, Dominique.
Hey, Corey Joe, it's good to be here with you.
So great to have you. We also have Michael Hostad, the executive director of the Commons in affiliation with the GMC and the co-founder of Light the Home. Hey, Mike.
Hey, Corey Joe. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Yeah. We got Sheena Carey, who's the internship director and a lecturer at Marquette University. Hi, Sheena.
Hi.
We also have Samantha Maldonado, who's kind of a regular on these Race Bridge conversations at this point. She's actually my friend. She would be at my party, which is why she's on these conversations with us so much. But she's the senior leader of diversity and inclusion at Coles. Hey, Samantha.
Hey, Corey. Great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, great to have you. Sue Northey is the founder and chief strategy officer at Branding Breakthroughs. Hi, Sue.
Hello. Thanks for inviting me. Looking forward to this.
Very exciting. Mary Louise Schumacher is an independent journalist and owner of Art Speak Media. Hey, Mary Louise.
Hey, Corey Joe and everybody. It's really nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Nice to have another person with two names together.
That's right.
Very Southern. Deidre Garrett is the director of HR services and organizational development at MRA. Hi, Deidre. Glad to have you all here. Okay, so let me stop sharing so we can look at your beautiful faces, and I'm going to hop into the questions right away. Okay, so for those of you who are in the conversation, feel free, go to the chat with conversation. Okay, any discussions that you want to have, if you're inspired by anything that we're saying, if you want to give an amen, if you want to co-sign, you go to the chat to do that, right? If you have questions that you want me to pull from and share at the end, then you want to go to Q&A. It'll be easier for me to find your questions that way, okay? Also, make sure you go to your view and pick the view that you like the best. I actually like gallery view so I can see everyone at once, but choose the format that works best for you and get comfortable. Thanks to all the participants. We got almost 200 people and we'll have close to 1,000 people viewing this on Facebook. So this is really, really exciting that so many people are interested in the relationship between diversity and segregation and belonging and all of this good stuff, Dominique, that you sparked. So I'm going to start. My first question is for you. Tell us a little bit about what sparked your interest in this and what inspired you to sort of launched the Belonging Program now, Ken?
So every year I do a curiosity project, and it is a year-long exploration of something that I'm curious about. So in 2018, I created a curiosity project around belonging. I'm not from Milwaukee and had struggled with this racial segregation myself. And so was just interested in how other people were thinking about this and navigating the segregation in our city. So I started out and I was going to interview about 20, 30 people, but by the end of the year, I'd interviewed 72 people. And a bunch of people across the city, across races, classes, people that did all kinds of different stuff for a living. And there were two big themes that kind of came out of those conversations. There was a lot that came out of those conversations, but there were two big themes. One was that people were craving depth in their relationships that they really didn't have. And so for a variety of reasons, you know, life is busy, people have kids, people have a lot of stuff going on, we work a lot of hours. But people were quick to like identify that like, I really want to go deep in my relationships, but I don't. Like a lot of the relationships I have are on the surface. And this was particularly true for cross-racial relationships. So people talked about even if they had people of different races in their lives, like they certainly were not going deep with them. And then the second thing that came up was that people really thought about segregation as an issue for the city that kind of sat outside of themselves. So they were like, yeah, that's a huge issue, but not like they didn't love segregation, but they didn't hate it enough to go out of their way to individually do something about it. Or they like went into this mode of like, that's just too big for me to do something about. Like, what am I with my little one life going to do about segregation? And so, it occurred to me that there needed to be like a mechanism, like something easy, you know, my little change management um, gear started spinning, and it needed to be something people could access and that people didn't have to go out of their way to do. So fast forward to the pandemic. And I just got this idea. I had participated in Mosaic many years back and a few other things that uh, kind of spurred my thinking around this. And I started to match up the belonging participants for these conversations with the idea that they would have a set number of conversations. For most of those conversations, they would not talk about race. They would just work on forming a relationship. The conversation guides were developed specifically to get them more and more vulnerable with each other so that they could be in relationship. And then their final conversation, they exchange questions that they've been holding about race or difference and select the questions that they feel comfortable answering, and that becomes their final conversation guide. I think we talk about the disparities around race a lot in our city, but we don't have the depth of our relationships to really get to the real conversation. And so my thinking was just like, how do you get people, number one, to get to that depth of relationship so we can really start to work on this stuff? And then number two, because the segregation is difficult for me personally, and I know that we can do something about it individually. What's the like quick mechanism? What's the easy mechanism? What's the mechanism for people to start to connect across races? So that's kind of the history in a nutshell.
As you've been rolling out the new iteration of this program, talk a little bit about what it is now and how it has evolved. I'll put a link in so people can check it out, and we have a slide so people can see it. Talk a little bit about that.
Yep, absolutely. So I did over the course of the pandemic, really three different pilots with three different groups of folks to test out everything. So to test out the questions, to test out the matching criteria, to test out all of these components. And now that has evolved into Kin, which is an online platform that will basically support me in doing that. So for the pilot projects, it was just me and my MacBook and sending out emails and questions and reflection links and all this stuff. And so we're building this online platform that automates some of that. It'll be officially launched at the end of the month, so anyone across the city could sign up. With the idea that I wanted something, the feedback that I got from all of the from all of the pilots was really extraordinary. And I don't think I had in my mind to kind of build an online platform when this started. I was just walking a path, but the feedback was really extraordinary. And reading the reflections from these guys and a bunch of other folks just kind of sparked in me that like this needed to be made available for all those who were interested, right? And so I'm hoping that the online platform will do that.
So right now people can, I'm going to put the link in here. People can kind of get on your mailing list. So when this is open and you're accepting participants, and guys in the chat, follow that link and add yourself to the list. Okay, so Dominique, if we of these 6 folks that were here, what were the rules of engagement? Well, I read that there were certain things that you couldn't talk about. There was a certain number of conversations you had to have. What was the setup for them? What did they all go through together?
Yep. So they all had these, I think they're all from different pilot groups.
Okay.
So the number of questions and the questions changed for each of the pilot groups. So some people had, I started out and I was like, okay, you guys are going to do 4 conversations. Then I was like 5, and now we're at 6. That seems to be about the right number. And the only rules are really that you complete your conversations in a set period of time, and it depended on the number of conversations. And that you don't talk about race or politics or difference, that you try to use the guide. I encourage them to use the guide. I'm looking at them right now. I know a lot of them didn't because I read your reflections. So they would use like a question from the guide here, a question from the guide here, but they're like, we don't need your questions, Dominique. We were having a really deep conversation about so-and-so. I'm like, okay, all right. I hear you in the reflections. But those were really the only rules. And the idea again is that like, we don't get to know each other. Like, I know all of these people on the screen. I know Mike, I know Deidre, I know, and I've had conversations with them, but I'm like, I don't know what your childhood was like. I don't know how you feel about your relationships. I don't know what keeps you up at night. Like, how do I actually get into relationship with you so I can understand how you see the world?
Yep. That's awesome. I read that and I wanted to mention it because I initially thought, oh, they had deep conversations about race and their, what, and I'm like, okay, well, this kind of forces us to really not separate ourselves by racial experience and more on the commonalities that, how do you forge real friendships? It's not talking about race.
That's right. That is not the way that you start. Like, that's not the way you would start any relationship, right? Like, but that's what we do. That we are not short on conversations about race in this city. We're absolutely not short on those. But that's not how you form real relationships. I'm not going to a workshop or anything on race and coming out and be like, you know what? I really made like a connection with someone that I want to spend more time with. And so this kind of reverses that, right? It's like, how do we do the relationships? And then how do we like move into having the real conversations with the idea that by the time I get to the 6th conversation, the one where we can talk about race, you're not my best friend. And this really isn't even about friends, but I know you enough, I trust you enough where I can ask that question that I probably wouldn't have asked when I met you during the first conversation, right? And so like, I now feel comfortable, you know who I am, you know that I've been wondering. And that question is not a question that I would have asked in a workshop. It's not a question that I would have asked in any other context, but now I'm in enough of a relationship with you where we can begin to have a real conversation about these things.
Okay, so that's really strategic. So by that time, you've built up some trust and relationship, and then you can kind of get into those conversations, which is really how real friendships are formed, into the deeper stuff as we get closer. Okay, so now I'm going to talk to the folks that participated in this. My first question for you, and I'll have all of you answer it briefly if you like. What made you want to do this? So when Dominique reached out to you and said, hey, I'm doing this, and I'll start with you, Sheena. When she started, she said, hey, I'm doing this. I want you to do what made you say, yeah, that's interesting. I'll do that. And what was your first thought when you heard
Well, that was that was my first thought. Oh, that sounds interesting. I love to talk. And, I was the kid that was always, at the parent teacher conference, she talks a lot. Or people really just are just drawn to her and want to talk to her. So, I mean, it was fine in terms of an extension of kind of what I do. I still can't remember how I got involved. I don't know if my friend Missy sent my name in or she said, this is something you might want. I have no idea, but I also have no regrets because it was it was just a great opportunity because not only did I have the opportunity to learn about someone else, but it deepened my awareness of myself, my understanding of myself. Because, you know, when you don't really know what you believe or what you value until you start having those conversations.
Mhm.
So it just sounded like something that would be really well worth participating in. It was intriguing and somewhat freeing that we had this proviso that we could not talk about race, because during that time, that was the last thing I wanted to talk about anyway, because, you know,
Okay.
people were they were well intentioned, but they were trying to steer me into conversations I just didn't want to have.
Mhm.
So that was wonderful too. So that was kind of intriguing. And I wanted to see if I could have a conversation with someone else without it veering into that particular topic area.
Yeah.
And with Mary Louise, we had some fun. I had some fun. I think she had some fun.
So okay, so Sheena and Mary Louise were paired together. Mary Louise, what was your first impression of this one, and what made you want to participate in it?
I think knowing Dominique just a little bit is what made me want to participate in it. I had a conversation with her in a completely different context about democracy, and I found her to be one of the most like intentional humans I've met literally ever,
Aw.
and trusted her. Like she said, "Do you want to do a thing?" And I was like, "I'm going to do the thing," because I trusted her. And it really just felt like you know, this thing that you want to build across these divides in your city, you don't know how to do it, and there's something about doing it in a way that's not out in the world where people can see you, it's private, it's between one other person, that just felt somehow right to me. And so instinctually that just felt like the thing to say yes to. So yeah, that's why I said yes.
That's awesome. Okay, so for the panelists that are here talking with me, there are people in the chat that are either reading you or making comments. So feel free to go in the chat and check that out too. And for the folks in the chat, make sure when you send out your responses, if you want everyone to see it, make sure you set the setting for panelists and participants so everybody can see what you're saying, because I think the default might just be for it to come just to the panelists. So just be mindful of that. Okay, Michael, who was your partner?
Deidre was my partner, and we had a great time. I decided to participate because I've learned over the years that you just don't say no to Dominique. But in all seriousness, I thought the idea was great. I had participated in Mosaic a while back, and I kind of wanted that to be more. And I think I was maybe just at the point in my career where it just didn't quite stick. And so I was hopeful that this would, and I'm confident that it will. And I really liked just sort of the approach, and also I was craving to meet new people in the middle of a global pandemic. So I mean, timing wise, it really worked out well. And so there were no expectations of having to have these certain conversations. It was just meet a cool person, have a conversation, and take it from there. And how could you say no to that? So so it was great. I really enjoyed it.
Okay, Deidre, what was your take on it? What made you say yes?
Yeah, well, firstly, I have a lot of respect for Dominique as well. So when she asked me, the answer was yes. And secondly, I'm a super curious person. I love meeting new people, connecting and networking with other individuals. So I was just interested in being in a new experience. And it was a learning experience. And I would say Mike and I are probably the offenders. We didn't stick to all of the guides, but we had really great discussion. And we found while we have some differences, we have a lot of similarities as well. So it was a great experience.
That's awesome. Okay, so Sue, that means you were paired with Sam.
I was.
Okay, so
And,
what was your thought when Dominique approached you for this?
So I had two reasons. One was Dominique and I worked on a project together, and we started kind of like our own little belonging session. And it was the most liberating conversation I'd ever had, because we decided right off the bat it was a safe zone, and we could, talk about things that we weren't sure of, and nobody would judge each other. And it was such a wonderful experience that when she asked me, it was a no-brainer. Secondly, I think I claim the oldest of the group here.
Maybe.
And so being both a baby boomer and, growing up in 100% white neighborhood, mostly Catholic, I came from a very singular view of the world, and I've been on a journey my whole life to change that. And so this was a wonderful opportunity to kind of progress that journey a little bit quicker, I think. So, and it was wonderful.
That's awesome. Okay, Samantha, what do you think? It's your turn.
Yeah, I could just say ditto to what everyone else said, but I agree with a lot of it. Like Dom and I have been part of a book club where she called me to the table a few times on some of the conversations we've had about just being intentional and honesty and reflection. And so I built this sense of trust and honesty and understanding with her. So again, when she asked, I'm like, I'm down, because I believe in what you're trying to build, and also very much curious as to what the experience will be, and craving that connection when we're all kind of holed up at home. So like multiple reasons. And again, wanting to engage in beyond, even though I have a very diverse set of friends, I had shared with Sue, if we were at one of those kind of networking events, I don't know if I would have had the gumption just to walk up to her to make that introduction or make that connection. So having this intentional and thoughtful pairing, and I even asked Ellen, like, how did you pair everyone together? Like, what were some of those characteristics or parameters? And she just has an innate ability to do it. I was just curious, and I'm like, let's just trust the process, go with the flow, and really engage and get the most out of it. And I would say that's exactly what Sue and I were able to do. And we did follow the questions, but it was great. It was a good experience.
I think we might have messed up the last session, but
hey, yeah, we did enough, and then we had a fluid moment. That's all good.
I think about when I put up that slide, when I found that graphic of, if imagine if you have 100 friends and you invited them all to a party, what would the room look like? And I'm guilty. Mine would be very much aligned to what the stats were from the survey. So I started thinking about, like, how do we start to develop the patterns and behaviors of connecting that we do? And the first thought that came to my mind is middle school lunchroom. I don't know if it was true in elementary school, but definitely in middle school, where there would be tables and tables and tables of kids of one race. And we're all in class together. We all got along. We would speak together, speak with each other in class. We were, doing assignments together in class, but somehow when it was time to socialize, we completely segregated, self-segregated. And it's like, we just continue to do that through. Dominique kind of localized what that survey showed nationally and bringing it to Milwaukee and what belonging means in the segregated city. And I'm thinking about all the elements that go into that, how we're raised to socialize, being in a segregated city, and then being in a city that, Milwaukee is not as transient as like a Chicago or a DC. And we tend to have a lot of the same friends that we sort of grew up with, that we met at that table in middle school, and the pattern just continues. So I'm just wondering for all of you, and Dominique, your perspective is probably going to be different because you're not a native Milwaukeean, but what did your networks look like before this? And did you find it difficult to naturally sort of diversify? Is it even something that you thought about? Sheena, I'll start with you, and then anybody can jump in.
Well, I'm like Dominique. I'm from someplace else. I came here to go to college. I grew up in Washington, D.C. when it was called Chocolate City. So that lunchroom looked a particular way because that was everybody. That was everybody.
Okay.
But I've always been very intentional about making certain that I had a wide network. So when you look at the cafeteria at Marquette when I was an undergrad, it was very mixed. It was very mixed. Even just sort of, my first crush in elementary school was a little guy named David Steinberg. You know what I was saying? So I was already kind of like, you're a nice person. I kind of want to hang out with you. And so the making certain that, I was connecting with people as people first, as opposed to I need to have X number of white friends, X number of Latinx friends, X number. It's just sort of kind of, we connected. And what this project did for me was affirm a thought that I've always had, is that when we connect with people, even though outwardly there may seem to be differences, chances are we're going to find that there are more points of connection than others will tell us there are. So having that network, nothing has really changed except I've added Mary Louise to it now. It was very affirming. It was very affirming. And when I look at my children, they have the same sort of networks as well, because I was also trying to be as intentional as possible when they were coming up, that there was this large group that they could point to and get some sustenance from.
Anybody else want to jump in? What did your network look like before? What patterns did you develop, and how did you go about that? I saw Deidre unmute, and then we'll go with Sue.
Yeah, I was going to say similar to Sheena, and I think Sam used the word as well, intentional. So my parents were really intentional about exposing us to a lot of things, but also making sure that we always looked at people's hearts and kind of character versus color and culture and kind of where they came from. So I was always brought up in that way. But I would also say I had a unique experience where, while I was raised in Milwaukee, where I was in predominantly white environments with my schooling, I also chose to go away to an HBCU at Hampton University, which is the best university on earth, but that's another thing. I chose to go away because I wanted a different experience. And one of the things that I think I took away from this experience is there's kind of three different ways that kind of shape our cultural views. So typically it's kind of like community. So where we grow up, how we grow up, and workplace, and then just our life. And I was thinking, I want to be more of an active participant in my life of really generating more friendships with people who do not look like me. While I have a really diverse network of friends, or group of friends, I should say, that all don't look like me, I still want to be active in that. But then also, how can I transfer that to my day-to-day work as well? So I think that's important.
Yep. Sue?
I think for me, I gave the head nod before that I grew up in a 100% white neighborhood. All my schools were 100% white. And frankly, I'm in my 60s, so that was not even on my radar screen, race at that point. It wasn't too much of a conversation when I was a child. It was really when I went off to college that perspective began to broaden and change. And then when I got out into the workplace. But again, I think I have a little bit of a difference from everybody, that conversation has changed dramatically in my lifetime. And as it has changed, I have tried to intentionally change my journey as well. But so many of my friends remain people from college, family, etc. And so it's something I've had to work at, which is why I wanted to be a part of this, so that I could kind of move my journey a little bit quicker along this trajectory. So
I think for me, when I'm thinking about my own journey, and I mean, like many of you, I feel like I have a really diverse network of associates. But in terms of the people that, if my kids see them, they run up and hug them, or folks that have been in my house and can just ring the doorbell and raid my refrigerator. And, that I feel like I have a lot of work to do in that area. And part of it is just like the regional behavior of like having friends forever and everybody else is just an associate. But I really think about that now in a way that I didn't when I was younger. I've had people invite, like Dr. Malika Syker has invited me into her home to meet her kids and bring, and that behavior of just making the offer and just saying, hey, come over here and I'll make dinner, and that's all it takes. Sometimes we don't take that next step. Somebody says, eat out of my fridge is definitely a friend's classification. Right, come and raid my refrigerator. Dominique, talk to us a little bit about what you've seen in your hometown versus your experience here. Were there any differences, any contrast in the way that people do connect across the race? Are there differences?
Well, I grew up in a suburb in Cincinnati and Mississippi. So my dad lives in Mississippi, my mom lives in Ohio. And I think the big difference for me was that, it was a racially diverse suburb. It's not that people weren't in their groups, but we had enough contact, enough connection where everyone didn't seem altogether foreign, right? And so you had Black kids that were like, well, yeah, I of course know this heavy metal band and I know what that, like there was enough cultural overlap where it felt more fluid. And I think when I got here, what occurred to me was that like you have to make real choices about how you're going to engage. So you're either going to do this over here with these folks and they do this, or you're going to do this over here with these folks and they do this. But there's not a lot of overlap in this city because of the racial segregation. So that means like that means everything that comes with that. It means every aspect of your culture is not being integrated into someone else's. And so we have like these really interesting but very distinct places where I feel like you have to say, okay, am I going to go to this place and I'm not going to see any people of color here, but I'm going to like, this is the experience I want to have, or if I'm going to go over here because I want to be around people of color and this is the experience I'm going to have. But they're so rarely integrated. And that was not the case in the space that I grew up. Like you could go into a space and it was a bunch of different stuff kind of just swirled up together.
I remember the first time I went to what is it? What is it in DC? Is it something in Poets?
Bus Boys and Poets.
Bus Boys. I was about to say Po Boys. I'm like, that's not it. Bus Boys and Poets. The first time I went into that space, and it's kind of like performance, spoken word, bookstore, and there were all kinds of people in there. And I just remember being in shock by it. I was like in my early 20s, and I was like, wow, I've never seen anything like this. It's like every person I looked at had a different shade, and it was really interesting. So we have a little bit more effort that we have to put forth in Milwaukee, and I think that goes back to what you all were saying about that intentionality. I want to ask each of you, what did you learn from your pairing? You can answer from the perspective of something that was revealed in conversation, or just what you learned about how you make friendships. But in that time together, these 6 conversations, what is something that either surprised you about yourself, or that was sort of, wow, this is new, I didn't realize? I'm going to start with you, Mike, because you look like you're searching, and then we'll go to Samantha. I didn't see you, Samantha. We'll go to you next.
Yeah, so I think one of the things I learned was how comfortable and open I felt with Deidre almost right from the get-go. I didn't know what to expect kind of going into this, and I learned, I think, partially that we didn't follow any of the rules, and that was like okay in all of this. I think, Dominique, right? I'm starting to wonder now too if I'm just friends with Dominique as part of a grand experiment that she is hosting in her life. But and I'm okay with that, Dominique, for the record. But in all seriousness, I think that it just felt right, and I think part of what I learned was that I went into my conversations with Deidre with a purposeful sense of just saying, like, I'm going to be open. I'm gonna see where this goes, and I knew going in to that. I think if I would never approach a random person in a coffee shop and strike up a conversation, I would, I am like I'm an introvert, I guess, but I like to be social. So, I wouldn't be that person that would go and do something like that. But when sort of paired together and said, hey, have this conversation, see where it goes. There's no expectations here. We just want to learn. I think I learned that I did well in that scenario. And because of that, I was more open in a way to really just receive the conversation that Deidre and I had as really being focused on building that connection, that relationship, and that friendship, and that there wasn't anything else tied to this. And it was kind of freeing in a way. There were none of those expectations, and so we ended up, and I think that's why we went totally off script, because we just started having a conversation like 2 friends would. And so I don't know if I'm answering your question, Corey Jo, but it was a great experience in that regard. I think I did learn about myself in a lot of ways, and also just hearing this conversation, I'm thinking back to my upbringing and just, you know, all of this. I am definitely in your camp, Corey Joe, in terms of my friend network would look primarily like me. And so I think that focus on being more intentional is really critical. I think my job at the GMC has changed a lot of that for me over the last 7 years. And Dominique can speak personally to that, as we've had a lot of conversations around that. But this is all part of, I think, what starts to change what we are all desperately trying to change in Milwaukee. And while we can have all the conversations about all the things, it really does start with trust and friendships and relationships. And I think that's why this is so important. And that's what I really took away from it and what I learned about myself in all of that.
That's perfect. Samantha?
Yeah, what I took away with it is, or from it really, is that Sue and I, similar to what Michael shared, is we were able to get into kind of like the raw, gooey center, like really quickly, right? There was this shared vulnerability right away. We were both very willing to kind of unpack the onion, right? And have that shared space of trust and honesty and reflection, and give each other the space to kind of just be in the moment, right? And my husband over here is like, who is that you're talking to? Like, what are you sharing? And I'm like, it's Sue, you know, like it was all good, right? And he's like, oh, you know, but that's the honest truth. Like right out of the gate, you know, it was, we gave each other kind of that sense of it's okay, right? We were both willing to kind of pour into each other and receive it. And I think, again, just to kind of speak to Dom's innate ability, we got along really well. You know, we were able to really connect on a different level and share things that I normally wouldn't share with someone in the first 40 minutes of meeting them. And so I think there was just kind of that yearning to have that more of that depth. Like for me, the high level shishiness makes me bonkers. I need to have that gooey center conversation. And I was able really to have that with Sue. And so, yeah, it's just that depth of connection. It's knowing I can count on them or call on them if I have a question or, you know, help me figure something out. And that's what I really appreciated. Yeah, we used the questions as a guide, but we got deep. It was like a question led to a question led to a question, right? And we even both agreed that after the pilot, we wanted to continue the conversations as friends. And so it wasn't like, you know, one and done, but we were, you know, connected on a different wavelength than where we had started.
How long were the conversations generally? Like, were you ascribed like an hour or?
About an hour.
Yeah.
Yep.
Mary Louise, as a writer, I know you probably were just constantly thinking and analyzing this in a very interesting way. What did you learn about yourself through this experience?
Well, and first of all, I just want to say up front that our conversations went on a little longer than an hour. They were like, okay, we're supposed to be doing this for 45 minutes and it's like more than 2 hours later. So yeah, I mean, I will say, because Sheena and I are both writers, that we got so much pleasure, I think, out of this. Like, I think everything that everyone has just said about going very quickly to that place of trust and vulnerability is really true. And for those who haven't experienced this project, it's because of the questions. You're not leading with your resume. You're not leading with an issue for discussion. You're talking about your mother. You're talking about your childhood. You're talking about very real human things. And what I really found, and I don't want to overstate this, but like a sense of recognition. Like I felt like Sheena and I had these moments where it was almost spooky how much affinity we felt for each other and how much we recognized ourselves in each other and our experiences. And we really thought, like, did Dominique like have super spy skills to put us together? Like, how did she do this? Like, it really felt so like unusual. And like I said, I think we're also so conditioned to not be vulnerable. And, you know, it was when you let go and you're real with a person, there's so much that can come from that. There's just so much. So it's like it was a joy and a gift, and I'm really grateful.
Anybody else want to jump in on that one?
I heartily agree.
Yeah.
It was wonderful. Separated at birth. That was by decades too, but you know.
I think the only thing I would add, I was going to say, the only thing I would add is it made me realize that it's good to tell people when you go into a conversation, hey, this is a safe place. You can say, you can ask what you want, you can do what you want. You know, after the Kenosha situation, I called Dominique and said, hey, can we talk about this? Because I've never had anybody I could talk about things like this with before. And I think Sam and I got to that same place where we could just ask those maybe delicate questions that you never felt you could ask someone before. And so I think we have to all give each other permission to talk about, to have those conversations and to not judge each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like those conversations too, they're not as fatiguing when you actually have a relationship with the person.
Yeah, and it's
Right.
and to realize that ignorance doesn't necessarily mean that you're prejudiced. It may just mean you're ignorant, you know, and that you need to be educated so that you're not ignorant anymore. You know,
access and exposure, right? We have to have, that's what it's all about. Dom, what are we going to say?
Well, but that's kind of the whole point, is that we do need to have the conversations, but you can't do it with everybody. And so if I hadn't been in a relationship with Sue, and I would have been annoyed, right? If someone brought that question to me, I'd be like, oh God, why? But because we had a different type of relationship, like, I know her, I know she's genuinely curious, I know she's genuinely trying to figure this out, I know she's doing the best she can, and I can have a different type of empathy and engagement, with a different level of empathy and different type of engagement. But without that, then it makes that space almost unmanageable. Yep. And really burdensome for people of color.
Yep. But not if you've already started to invest in that person. I mean, that's why I think this is just so brilliant, because it wasn't a series of conversations about race. It's just the human connections, which are, you know, that really is how people bond and come together. And it's just so smart, very exciting, very exciting. What are you all doing differently now, having gone through this process and learned everything that you learned? There's a good question in the Q&A where someone said, were there any changes you noticed in yourself as you were participating in the conversations? And were there changes that your friends or loved ones noticed? Like, are you moving differently through the world? Are you reaching out to people? Do you network differently? I know that's kind of a hard question coming out of like over a year of quarantine, but your mentality, do you feel like you would be more open to bringing more people into your close core network when they don't look like you?
Well, I can answer that very quickly. Same as, business as usual, because that's sort of the focus or not the focus, but sort of how I navigated the world anyway. It was nice to be affirmed that those choices that I made were good ones, and were good for me, as well as good for, not only my friend group, but, my family as well.
Yep. Deidre?
I was going to say there wasn't anything that I necessarily changed in like my behaviors, because in general, I always try to pursue people who are not like me and try to be intentional in developing and cultivating relationships on a regular basis. What I would say, if there's one thing that I don't know if it's learned or want to make sure that I'm continually doing as a leader, whether it's at work or in my community or at church, et cetera, is always to communicate that it's okay if people don't know everything. So acknowledging that it's okay if we don't know everything, acknowledging, I think Mary Louise said it, it's okay to be vulnerable. And I think maybe that's the challenge, and maybe even the issue, if that's a strong word, with our city, is it's like, if you're vulnerable, it's a bad thing. But I feel like vulnerability breeds freedom. Right. So if people were more vulnerable, they could be honest with each other, be in deeper relationship with each other, which would build people's trust and understanding of each other, and especially different cultures. So that's, for me, it's like, how can I share that with more people? How can I challenge more leaders and others to think in that way?
And Sue, I'm interested in how you're operating differently. I mean, you were clearly on a path and very intentional and looking to broaden your network. How has this experience changed you in the way that you connect with people?
Well, first of all, COVID has hurt a little bit because we're still not out in the world a lot yet, or at least I'm not. So I would say the biggest impact has been with family and friends. And at a time when a presidential election was going on with someone who, well, I don't want to turn this into a political conversation, but let's just say that I became bolder in my friend and family networks to make my voice heard, and not in an emotional way, but in a way of saying, wait a minute, think about what you just said. You know, I didn't want to get people's dander up and get them emotional or upset. So I did it in a less confrontational way, but I clearly have changed the patterns of how I talk to family and friends because of this experience. And I'm proud of myself. You know, it's been it's not always an easy thing to do, really. And so sometimes it takes courage to stand up to people you've known all your life and make your voice heard.
Yep.
I'm proud of you too, Sue, because I've seen your journey and you have like mustered up a lot of courage and really shifted how you show up around this stuff. So I just wanted to say that.
Oh, sweet. So the panelists, I'll have you think about this. Think about in your conversations, what was one of the questions that you thought, man, this is a really good question and opened up good conversation. And I'm asking you to share that because there's so many people in the chat who may or may not be able to go through this process under Dominique's fearless leadership. And they might just be like, I need some questions off the cuff, so I know I'll go prepared. So think about that. Dominique, somebody in the chat did ask, and folks are signing up, so you'll be getting email addresses from people that want to participate whenever that is available. But what were the areas of conversation? So if there were like 6 conversations, where there's certain themes for each one, can you share that?
The conversation, guys, were intentionally designed just to increase the level of vulnerability in the conversation as they move forward. And everyone kind of the different groups had different conversation guides. And so I played around with the questions a lot. Now there are a gazillion conversation guides because I learned a lot from those in the pilot project. So I saw that question in the chat, and there's no like, conversation number 1 is about this and conversation 2 is about that. Instead, it's like, here's the level of vulnerability we're starting at, and I'm trying to get you to this level of vulnerability by the 5th conversation. So I wish I could be more helpful in like sharing some guidance for people that want to do it on their own, but it's a little more complicated than that.
Yeah, that's good. Sign up, use the link. I'll post it again. Okay, so do you guys have your questions in mind? Are you ready? Mary Louise, I'm coming to you.
I can't remember the exact question. And Mike, do you remember there was a section about family, but I feel like there was a deep question about something you would miss or regret. I can't remember the exact question, but we went really deep in that session, and we learned that we actually have a lot of similarities just in our upbringing and family, and just how we are just in relationship with our spouses. So I think that helped us develop like a base for kind of understanding and trust between the two of us. And I can't remember the exact question, but I think it helped kind of steamroll us into some other things. And we may have veered off a little bit, Dominique, but then we went back to the guide.
Right. Yeah, I would agree, Deidre. That's exactly where my brain was going to in this one was that family conversation. And I think that was like our first, if not our second conversation, but just really set the groundwork, I think, for everything else that we then veered on and off of with the discussion guides. But yeah, that was one that stuck in my head as you were asking, Corey Jo, is that family question.
I mean, you don't get more universal than the family question. You really don't. It's like,
no, especially
my mom, my uncle's crazy,
right.
like.
Right. You know, in the middle of a political election and all that sort of things. There were comparisons that were made for sure. So yeah, it was good though.
I can also say, I think it made it interesting in comparison to maybe your other classes, Dominique, for the Belonging Project, because during this time, obviously we've had a it's just a very tumultuous time. It's a lot going on in the world, right? So there's a lot to discuss and unpack just within our conversations. And while I don't think we ever directly talked about race, there was a lot of things happening around, social justice. And we talked about, we did veer into politics, Dominique, which I think we weren't supposed to talk about that, but we got around to kind of talking about our viewpoints and also just how it's affecting us, right? In our families, our lives, and things of that nature. And also, again, like I said, we found that we had a lot of similarities just in our viewpoints, but also similarities in the way in which it affected us, which I think is important.
So as we get ready to wrap, I kind of want to bring this back to the question of, what's on everybody's mind? What are we doing every day at work? It's the most intense I've ever seen people talk about diversity, equity, inclusion. And I struggled a little bit with the marketing of this because I truly believe that friendship matters. When you can see some atrocity or see something happen and there's somebody that you love and that you're close to, that it impacts their life, their family, their culture. I think it really changes the way that we look at things that don't necessarily affect ourselves. But when we say, oh, we're just friends, I think we minimize friendship as something that's just kind of, doesn't have any power, but it's not true. I mean, I feel like it has all the power in the world, right? So thinking about this experience, and if we could get half of Milwaukee go through this process, what do you think, how would that impact these conversations about diversity, equity, inclusion in the workplace, in our community, segregation, even how we, our built environment and how we operate? Do you think friendship has the power to really start to affect those things, and why? And anybody can respond to that.
I actually do. One of the things that happened this year is I became sort of responsible for, we call it our JEDI work, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion for our college. And I find that it's not so much about implementing a plan, but establishing, developing, and maintaining those relationships. Because once we have those relationships, we want to do better. We want to do more. And so just kind of taking it outside of this being something else we're going to do, it's the way we're going to do things, not only in terms of the work, but how we're going to interact with one another and connect with one another. So that in terms of the Belonging Project has been very beneficial in that regard, in again affirming the idea of the power of relationships, because this is the only way things are going to get done. If you don't care about me, you're not going to want to change anything, and vice versa.
Yeah, I would agree. When you were asking that question, Corey, like, what's the question that resonates with you? And I was trying to feverishly look back at all the questions that Dom had shared. The one that resonates most with me is like, what does friendship mean to you?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And I, went through some, situations during the time with Sue with some lifelong friends, right? That, they cut you to the core when you had these people that have known you for years and it somehow seems to break. It's like a divorce in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
And so to your very point, Sheena, it's like to make any change, to see any progress, to see any sort of, percentage movement in behavior, you have to localize and connect with those stories of those individuals around you, right? It's not about changing the world, but changing the world around you. And then that's how you can start to really understand how that story affects me. It's not like I have diversity around me, so I'm diverse. It's how do I internalize and resonate with what's going around me, so that I understand and I have more information to make those decisions, to behave and adapt differently, and to consider who I'm engaging with at the GUI center and not just the composite, right? So understanding really why they behave the way they do, how do they interact with me? So it's a yes and opportunity. And so it's not like I'm seeing everything through my own personal filter, my own story, but it's my story and your story, and how do we meet in the middle? And you can't do that if there's not a willingness on both sides to make that happen, or there's not a trust built already, because then you're going to have the bias or the agenda kind of always clouding that conversation. And it's not getting, again, to really that trust and that baseline. Let's just chat about this. Help me understand, right? So it's a shared responsibility, shared accountability. And when you have the friendships as the baseline with that trust, that's when things start to move forward and you can hold each other accountable and be those accountability buddies. and call them to the table,
I
right?
love that.
Yeah, and be like, hey, time out, wait a minute, you know, and Dom's done that for me. She's like, hey, stop, take a breath, let's unpack this a little bit. And it's uncomfortable, but through the uncomfort is where the growth happens. That's where the magic happens. And I don't think people are willing enough to lean into that vulnerability and that humility at times. And that's what we need to encourage, to lean into that shared learning journey, that shared growth, and say, help me learn through this, and giving each other some space and grace to do that.
Dom, how many people have gone through this so far? And what, again, kind of give us a pitch for how people can get involved going forward.
Yep. So there were 3 pilot groups with, I think, a total of almost about 60 folks or so. And now people can sign up on the site. There's a bit more of a formal process. We'll be launching out in July. So people that sign up now, or at the end of June, early July. So people that sign up now will start to hear from us soon. We'll start getting people's profiles completed based on the criteria that we developed during the pilot project, and getting people matched up for a new round of conversations.
Amazing. So what I would like, as we're hopping off now, we're a few minutes over, those who are still here, participants, go into the chat. You know, I always like for you to leave a little love notes for the participants. Tell them what you learned, what you appreciated about their sharing. Thanks to all the panelists, and thanks to Dominique as you all are doing that. And this is any participants and anyone in on the panel. You know, we're at, what is it? It's 3:04 now. I know you got a conference call, another Zoom, something else to hop on. If you have to hop off, go ahead and hop off. If you have a few minutes, stay here and look at the chat and enjoy your love notes. But I was gonna play this video of close friends having a conversation, but a lot of their conversation was about race. And I decided, nope, I don't want to play that, because that's not what this was about. It was about connecting on things that other than race, and leveraging those connections for racial equity if needed, but it's really about connecting on something else. So what makes me think about that, in the spirit of our sponsorship with 88.9 Radio Milwaukee, is this song that I love, Milwaukee Strong, which is very diverse and the true reflection of all that we are. So I'm going to play this. It's a couple minutes so you guys can watch this video, listen to it. Participants, love notes in the chat, and the panelists that can stay, make sure you check out the chat and receive all the love. Thank you all for participating in today's Race Bridge. I can't wait to see you next month.
Through the fire, through the rain, our tomorrow will be a better day. 'Cause we are proud of what we know. We are the good land, Milwaukee strong. From the ashes and the dust, we will rise, we'll all stand up.
With hope in our eyes, we'll go on. We will rebuild brick by brick, stone by stone.
Through the fire, through the rain, our tomorrow will be a better day. 'Cause we are proud of what we know. We are the good land, Milwaukee strong.
Milwaukee strong like black coffee, yeah. Milwaukee black and brown, so please change policy, yeah. Milwaukee less work or ended poverty, Milwaukee growing, let's make sure that we grow it properly, yeah. Milwaukee home, so let our love show, Milwaukee special, invest in the homegrown. talent. We all searching for balance, united the good lands, approaching all of our challenges.
Hand in hand, you and me.
We're working together like a family.
Together we stand through it all. Hand in hand, standing tall. Every day, in every way, spreading love, and Milwaukee way. Loud and proud, through and through. This is who we are. This is what we do. Through the rain, our tomorrow will be a better day. 'Cause we are proud of what we know. We are the good land. Milwaukee strong. We are the good land.
We are the good land. Milwaukee strong.
God bless the good land.
Milwaukee strong.
That was great. I feel like that was great.
I love it. I love it. I never get enough of that song. All right. Thank you so much, Sam, Sue. Wait, we got families. Sheena's still here. Thank you guys. You were awesome. Thanks for your transparency.
I can see you better now. It's just the glare was bothering me, so I didn't want to start wearing in my glasses.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you, CJ.
So thank you so much.
Bye. Take care all.
Bye, everyone.